Hello and welcome to another episode of the Scripting Den podcast. Today we're going to be talking about how to get your manager to love you, or essentially how to be a good team player, or how to give your team lead or your manager essentially all these things that they are expecting from you just because you're there. Not because you set those expectations, but rather because the expectations have been set for you by someone else. So let's get going. So in the context of a normal dev team with a manager or a team lead, essentially being in front of that team, and when they are all working together for a single project, there are some expectations that the manager will have from you as a developer. These expectations are usually met with resentment or even friction from developers because we tend to believe that those expectations are incorrect. That since we're developers, the only real expectations that people should have from us is that we produce code. And I'm sorry to say, but that's not the case. There are more things that we should be working on as developers, and some of the ones that I'm going to be covering today are usually very far away from coding, and thus they tend to be not fun for developers, and that means we hate them. But we have to take care of them nevertheless. So the first one that I want to talk about is task tracking, essentially. Whether you're using Trello, Jira, Monday, whatever task tracking tool, Asana, I mean, there are tons of them. It's not fun. Going in there, checking what you have to work on, making sure that all the information that you require is there, or updating it if it makes sense, or changing the status, or making sure that you are currently working on what is reflected there is usually a pain in the ass. Sometimes because of the tool, sometimes the tool is just making it hard on us to keep track of what we're doing, and it's just a lot easier to just work on the things. And sometimes it's just that we're just too lazy, Sometimes it's just that we're just focused on writing the code and not worrying about anything else. The problem there is that these tools exist for a reason, The main reason is not for us though. And we have to understand that the manager, the leader, or whoever is in charge and responsible for the project, they usually need to understand at a glance how the project is doing. If the current sprint or work iteration is on time, if people are working on the things that they're supposed to be working, if whatever the dev team is doing aligns with the priorities that the project has. There are a lot of aspects of a project that fall aside, far away from the code, but are still very relevant and important. Now, as a manager, managers have the responsibility of keeping track of the project, understanding how things are going, if there are blockers, there are dependencies that are not being met. And they just have three ways to solve, to answer those questions. They can just make up the answer, assume things based on whatever they heard of a conversation, based on whatever you seem to be working on. They will just assume and just, report back the current status. That's, the worst idea. And, it's usually not something they would do. So there are just two things left, two proper tactics, essentially, to keep track of these aspects of a project. They can just ask you. They can just go, dev by dev, ask them what they're working on, how they're doing, if there are blockers, if they have problems, dependencies, if they will finish on time. They can ask all of those questions to you. Or, instead of bugging you, instead of keeping you from actually coding, they could potentially look at the task tracking system. The problem is, if that thing's not updated, then it's like not having a task tracking system at all. For them, it's just pointless. Whatever they will see there is not the actual truth. It's not the reality. So this is just about thinking about someone else other than you and the code. Essentially, the manager is meant to know this information. Your team lead is meant to know how the project is coming along, how your work is coming along, and the best way for you to report that is to update the tasks that you have assigned to you. You can spend more time on dailies. You can spend more time on one-on-ones or group meetings talking about these things, but that's a lot more time that you would be spending doing something else that is not coding, which is, I'm assuming here, your main priority. So remember, if you want your manager to love you, one thing that you should be doing is stop hating on Jira, stop hating on the task tracking system that you have, and just use it. Bite the bullet, as they say, and move on. Now, this takes me to the second point, meetings. Now, meetings, they have a bad rep. We all like to say that we spend a lot more time than we should on meetings, because in some companies, that is true. In some companies, there is a culture of meeting. There is a culture of avoiding asynchronous communication and trying to resolve everything one-on-one or in group meetings, and making everyone, waste their time listening to someone else about things that they don't really care about. Now, those are not all the meetings. Not every single meeting is like that. There are meetings that are actually great for solving quick problems, answering quick questions, instead of sending back and forth emails or chat messages that are just misunderstood. You can just hop on a call with someone else, ask them the question, clarify whatever you have to clarify, and then continue working. That's just like 2 minutes, 3 minutes. You don't have to be social about it. You don't have to spend 10 minutes talking about the weather and your family and your friends. You can just go straight to the point, ask the question, get the answer, and continue. That's way more effective than sending an email, for example. And there are other meetings that are also just as useful, even though they might be longer. For example, one that I really like, and if it's done well, if it's done properly, is the retrospective meetings. If you're doing proper Scrum, essentially, just at the end of a sprint, you sit down with your team and talk about what went right and what went wrong, and you open up a secure space for them to critique whether is the management of the team, critique someone else, critique even their own work, and try to come up with plans, processes, and even changing the way your team works to provide solutions for those problems. That is time well spent, in my opinion. Now, if you jump on a retrospective call and nobody's willing to be honest about their feelings about the sprint, and they all just say for 40 minutes, oh, everything's fine, we don't have any problems, we don't have any complaints. I've been to way too many meetings like that, and that's definitely a waste of time. If you calculate how much money the company is paying you for to lie to each other for 45-50 minutes, that's a lot of money spent on just wasting time. So now the point of this point essentially is that meetings are not de facto wrong, are not de facto the problem. The way you handle the meetings, the way you use that time is a problem. If you don't use it properly, if you don't own that time, if you don't use that time properly, then yes, absolutely, you just wasted your time and everyone else's time in the meeting. But if you plan the meeting, make sure every point that you want to make is made during the meeting, that everyone understood it, and most importantly, at the end of a meeting, everyone knows what the next action items are and who owns them, then that's a fantastically well spent time. You don't have to spend all your time coding. If this allows you to plan ahead, if this allows you to solve future problems, then why not have the meeting now instead of having the problems in the future? It's easy. It's an easy question. It's an easy question to answer. You should have that meeting, but plan ahead. Make sure that it's not overly long. Make sure that the point of the meeting, the topic of the meeting, is not derailed or hijacked by someone else bringing in their own problems. It's perfectly fine to cut someone else and say, we're not talking about this right now. We can set up another call or just send an email and discuss that offline. Right now, we're talking about this other topic, and that should be the focus right now. That should be the focus of the meeting. That nobody should take offense on that, because they are essentially doing the wrong. They are derailing the meeting. They are the ones wasting everyone's time. You're trying to actually make sure that you use that time properly. And that takes me to the next point, which is planning. As developers, we tend to go straight to the code. Whenever we see a task, if it's well detailed, it has everything we need to know about it, or even worse, if it's just loosely described what we have to do, then we just jump into the code. We just make the necessary assumptions about the things that, the holes in the description, and we just start coding. The problem with that approach is that we're essentially making assumptions that might not be the right ones, and we're just getting started without properly knowing how long this task is going to take us, or essentially what we need to be doing tomorrow about the task, or the next week if it's a very big task. So in this case, when you're getting started with a dev cycle, the best thing that you can do is look at the tasks that you have, plan ahead, review them, understand if there is a priority, make sure that everything that you have to do for these tasks is detailed there. If it's not, ask the questions. Make sure that you have all the details given to you, so you don't have to make assumptions. And make sure that you kind of know, you might have a feeling about it, or you might actually know roughly how long the task is going to take you. Why? So that you can be critic about the task being assigned to you. You can look at the task, go through it, and go back to your team lead or whoever created the task or the business requirement, and say, well, I'm missing this and this point, these 3 points. I don't know what to do about that. Should I just do this instead? That's where your assumption comes into play, but you're verifying the assumption now. Or should I wait for more details? This task is going to take me 3 days to work on. Now, as a manager myself, if a developer comes to me with those points, that's perfect. That's amazing. I know I messed up. I know I'm lacking the details that they need, and I also know exactly how long they're gonna take. So I can look at my planning and say, that's fine. If it's gonna take you 3 days, let's say 4, I'll just move this up in the roadmap a little bit. Next week we'll tackle it next week when we have the details that you need, and then you can go back to this. You can go back and work on something else in the meantime. That's fantastic. I was corrected. I was shown a problem, and now I have the tools I need to solve that problem. If instead you make the assumptions, you don't plan, you just get right into the code, 2 days later you give me the actual task and I look at it, I test it, and it's nowhere near to what I was expecting, because you made the assumptions that were not correct and I was missing those details, then I'm gonna have a problem. We're all gonna have a problem because the project is not going well. The dev cycle, the sprint is not going well. It's already, you wasted 2 days working on something that is completely wrong, and it's my fault. But it's also your fault because you didn't really specify, you didn't raise the hand and say, I have a problem. I have a dependency here on the details that I'm missing. You didn't plan ahead. So what I'm trying to say here is I'm not trying to blame developers. I'm not trying to blame managers either. There are things to do on this topic on both sides. But as a developer, I think that we have the responsibility to raise our hand and say, I have a problem with this task. It doesn't have enough information. Granted, that step is usually should usually happen during some pre-planning or planning session. But if you didn't have that, if it was done without you, because some teams do that, then more to a point, you should be able to raise your hand and say, I have a problem here. I was not asked about this, and I didn't get a chance to make these questions, and I have questions. I don't want to make unverified assumptions, essentially. This is what I'm thinking. Is it right? Please, Mr. Manager, tell me, am I seeing this correctly, or am I missing something? That is a perfectly valid dialogue to have, and should happen very often until you both know how to work together, and your manager will, or whoever is creating these tasks will eventually understand that you need this type of details. And finally, in the space of working on your tasks and working on the features that you have assigned to you, some developers have the tendency to believe that a more complex deliverable is usually better. They tend to think ahead, even beyond what the task is asking for, and make assumptions and think about potential future use cases or potential problems that there might be but are not specified right now, and they spend more time on the task to accommodate for that possible future. That's one way to over-engineer a task. And as a developer, you should always try to stay away from over-engineering. I tend to see over-engineering as a trap that we, as developers, tend to fall for, because we start making unfounded assumptions. We're talking about assumptions again. And that's a big problem in our area. Whenever we make an assumption, we should validate that assumption. Or at least we should deliver whatever we're building around those assumptions together with assumptions and say, all right, that's fine. This is what I built, and these are my assumptions for it. That's not ideal. It's an even better scenario would be you presenting your planning for the feature along with the assumptions and say, this is going to take me 3-4 days, and this is what I'm going to be working on because these are my assumptions. If all of these are true, then all the things that I've already told you, they're going to be a reality. If one of these things that are part of my assumptions is not true, then whatever I just said, might not happen. My delivery time might not be correct, or the list of things that I'm going to be working on might not be like that. It depends on what changes based on the assumption that you're correcting. So what I'm trying to say here is that when we start making assumptions, especially for the future, we over-engineer our solutions. If the task that we're working on doesn't cover that potential future, we shouldn't be working on it. If you want to be proactive, if you want to, actually get your manager to love you because you're being proactive, the right way to be proactive is to raise your hand and say, hey, these are my assumptions for the future. Are they correct? Should I be also working on this? And that might be a perfectly great action to take. Because if your assumptions are right, or even if they're not, but if you're showing interest in a potential future that your manager or your team lead or whoever is creating this task didn't really cover, then you might be opening up a door and to create a more detailed task for you to work on, and the extra detail might need extra time to work on it, but that's fine because you planned for it. You know how we're working back to the other advice, to the previous advice. You're planning ahead. You're planning for what's coming or what could come in the future. That's fantastic. if you present this type of problems and this type of dialogue to your manager, that's a great way to get them to see you, get them to notice you, and to really enjoy working with you, because that means that you're worried about the project, that you care about it, and that you're not just thinking of today, but you're also thinking about tomorrow. Now, that's the right way to think about the future. If instead what you do is you have those assumptions, you have those thoughts about what could potentially happen in the future, and then what you do is you just assume you're right and code for it, then you're probably making a mistake, because you probably don't have the full picture of the entire roadmap or the entire plan for the project. So that might be a problem. You're also gonna most likely take longer than initially thought for the task, because those extra assumptions were not present during the initial estimation. So you're going to over-deliver things that were not asked for, and you're under-deliver in the sense that you're going to take longer than originally considered. So that's a problem. That's not the right way to impress your manager. That's actually quite the opposite, because now you're seen as someone who thinks that they know everything and who are ready to go solo whenever they can. You're an over-engineer, and that's something you don't want to be. When you're working on a task, that's if think about the future, think about potential things that are missing in the description, potential details, make assumptions about them, and validate them. Only then, and also, about the assumptions, think about what kind of impact those assumptions will have in the task. Will they increment the time it takes to develop it? Will they change other parts of the description? That kind of things. Just think about it, plan for it, and then go back to your manager and validate all those assumptions. If they say you're right, then the task can be updated. If they tell you you're wrong because of reasons, then you can go back and just follow the task and forget about those assumptions. But if you're following the task without the extra assumptions, which is completely fine, just remember, if it works and and you can deliver it fast, that's fantastic. You don't have to over-engineer. You don't have to deliver something extremely complex on the side of code just to impress someone. Usually when it comes to code, the simpler it is, as long as it gets the job done, the better. Because that means it's easier to maintain, that means it's easier to understand by someone else. I like to say that code is meant to be read by humans and executed by computers. So remember, you're not supposed to be writing overly complex code for the computer. You're supposed to be writing simplified code, easy to read code for you in the future and for your colleagues. So think about that. And that's it. That's it for this episode. Very quick, short episode. But I think that all these topics, this advice will help you get improve your image in the face of your manager. I've been a developer myself, and I've been a manager myself, and I kind of been both sides of this equation. And I'm talking directly from experience. So remember, the summary of this episode is, and this is what I want you to leave thinking about, task tracking is not the devil's tool. Task tracking is actually useful, and if you do it right, and it doesn't have to be specifically useful to you, but it will be useful to your manager. So think about that. Meetings are not by default evil. Meetings can be great tools to quickly solve problems, to get insight into your team, into how they work, or even to find solutions to problems within the team. So as long as you're using that time within the meeting properly and you're not wasting anybody's time, then embrace meetings. Along with meetings, remember to plan and then code. Look at the task, Make sure that you know what it means. Make sure that you understand what you have to do and make a plan for it. Only then start coding. If there are questions during the plan, raise your hand, ask your manager whether your assumptions are correct or not. Finally, remember, assumptions lead to potential overengineer. So whenever you make an assumption, validate the assumption. Make sure that whatever extra things you want to work on makes sense for the projects and for your manager as well. And that's it. I hope you found it useful. I have a shameless plug to actually do this advice and more are part of my latest book, The Skills of a Successful Software Engineer. You can find it on Manning's, or you can find it on Amazon as well. You just Google Skills of a Successful Software Engineer. I'm actually going to leave the link in the show notes as well. In that book, I cover all this type of advice on the entire journey from starting as a developer to becoming even a team lead yourself. What to expect from your first code interview, from your first tech interview, to how to make sense of an offer from a company, what to look for, what to expect there, what to avoid, and then different aspects of the developer life. So if you're in the journey of becoming a developer, or if you're a new developer, check the book out. It might be good for you as well. And finally, a second shameless plug, because why not? If you're into Redis, if you like to know more about Redis, or if you actually were thinking about using Redis but you haven't really looked into, which is really sad because it's a fantastic database. I have a course about Redis Essentials on LinkedIn Learning. It covers everything you need to know about Redis to get started. It's been incredibly successful so far. More than 5,000 students have gone through it, and they all love it, more or less. So it's definitely something that if you're interested in Redis, you should check it out. So I'm also going to leave that link in the show notes. And that's it. No more shameless plugs, nothing else. Just enjoy your day and catch you on the next episode. Bye. And that was it for this episode of the Scripting Them podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Remember that you can find me online on Twitter at TheLeadMan123. And you can also find the podcast YouTube channel just searching for the Scripting Them on YouTube. Thank you again, and catch you on the next one.